The most frequently asked question when people get a diagnosis of a certain chronic disease is, why did this happen to me? Now, I know a couple of doctors who give a clear-cut, solid answer, but the vast majority of medical doctors leave us in the dark. But this nagging question doesn't go away, does it? So this 5-part mini-series answers the question, why did this happen to me? Why did this chronic disease happen to me is a question about the causes. Medical care over centuries is focused on symptoms, and treating symptoms is what medical care does very, very well. Amazingly excellent, actually. But knowing the causes will be game-changing for us. Leaving the causes free-flowing means treating symptoms like forever. When we know the causes, we can do something about it to feel better or shed it altogether. Now, before we start, note that I'm talking chronic diseases here, not specifically heart disease, cancers, arthritis, irritable bowel syndrome, obesity, and so on and on and on. What we'll understand later in this series is that the different types of chronic disease, in essence, are more alike than they are different. Yep, get ready for a different view on chronic disease. So back to the most frequent asked question when people get a chronic disease. Why did this happen to me? Well, I must have asked this question over 100 times over the past 40 years, primarily for my parents, whom I supported with their doctor's visits year by year by year, but also for myself. And from time to time when I work with medical doctors in a hospital. And I couldn't accept the answer that totally left us in the dark. Actually, that is the reason why I'm here. I wanted to know why chronic disease starts, develops, and most importantly, how we can solve chronic disease. Now, let's dig into these typical answers that we've got, and maybe you can relate. The most frequent answers that we get when we ask this most frequently asked question when we get chronic disease are typically 3. Number 1, chronic disease just happens. There's nothing really we can do about it. Number 2, it may be genetics. And number 3, it can be a mistake that the body makes. Frankly, chronic disease is called the unsolvable problem. Do you recognize? Well, it's quite unsatisfying or even frustrating. To me it is. Because it leaves us powerless, because we do not know what we can do, so we cannot do anything. And it leaves us having no control over our health, so no control over our life. It leaves us stuck with the impediments, the pain, the hassles that come with chronic disease. And it gives us a lot of insecurity about the future. Because the hallmark of chronic disease is progression. So that's not a great outlook, right? Most of us start digging on the internet, finding solutions for themselves. And the best that we can come up with are risk factors. Now, risk factors are not causes. It are ways that we can influence probability. And most of us know those risk factors either via the internet or other types of media, or even our doctor tells us. Probably we all get the top 5 risk factors like smoking, drinking, stress, bad foods, lack of exercise. But does that really give us more clarity? Well, for most of us, it leaves us in a spot of confusion, conflict, and custom bias. Conflict because there's a lot of conflict of information, like, is dairy bad for us, for everyone, or only for those with a lactose intolerance? Or is dairy bad in general? Or is yogurt an exception? So there's a lot of conflicting information on those risk factors. Secondly, it's probably an inner conflict, because when we do want to change our lifestyle to decrease the risk, well, we all have habits. So there starts an inner conflict because we want to keep our habits. Then there's a lot of confusion because there's a lot of information overload, and we simply do not know how to digest all this information. And there's confusion because we do not see a clear-cut relation between the risk factor and the occurrence of chronic disease. There's a huge gap there. And thirdly, there's custom bias. And that is not typically for chronic diseases. That's on all kinds of areas, like that most people think they are a better driver than average. I think I'm a better driver than average. Well, most people think that they have healthier habits, a healthier lifestyle than average. So they do not feel the urge to change. Now, statistically, that doesn't make sense, right? If the majority thinks that they are better than average. But there's more to the equation, I believe. What is, in my view, most overlooked are those long-lived, pan-cultural, global, deeper beliefs about chronic disease that are behind those answers. And I call them myths. Now, I believed those myths for a very long time, and I see so many people around me believing them, as I recognize it almost every day. And so many medical doctors believe them. But us all believing them doesn't make it truth. Those deep imprinted beliefs that we all grew up with and we take for granted, they are very hard to change. And when we see people who had those spontaneous remissions, we call them miracles because they do not fit in this belief. They do not fit in this paradigm. However, if we think about living with the impediments, the pain, the limitations, the insecurity about the future versus living in freedom in all those areas, or living with a lower quality of life versus a much higher quality of life, living the end of life versus living. Isn't it worth to reconsider our beliefs and open up to new possibility, to a new view that can be so game-changing for us? I believe it is. I'm strongly arguing for it, no surprise. So, in the next episode, let's debunk those myths and get a better insight on what is behind chronic disease.